How you doing, guys? This is Eric from RuleTheWasteland.com. I talked before in my prediction video that I have injected a full, heroic, semi-fatal dose of weapons-grade hopium and come to the conclusion that I'm officially predicting there will not be any nuclear detonations over the next 2 years. With that being said, that just means I think that it is 50.00 whatever percent, so it's slightly more likely than something happening. I actually think it's significantly more likely than not that there will not be any detonation, but it's obviously still an extremely possible, we're not talking about fraction of a percent, we're talking about at least high single-digit percent that some kind of nuclear detonation will occur, or something along those lines. And one of the more likely possibilities, if China or Russia were to decide to use nuclear weapons against the US specifically, would be some kind of EMP weapon, which we've known has been possible for a long time. It could devastate large portions of the country, especially the military and infrastructural command capabilities, without actually causing initially tons of death, tons of radiation, tons of destruction along those lines. And we know China has this secret space plane that's been flying around. It's an unmanned craft that just recently released at least one, I think 2 objects, satellites, whatever, of unknown what they are exactly, at least to the public. And there's a lot of speculation that these certainly could be some kind of EMP weapon that they're putting up there to be ready. Obviously, that's certainly possible. Could be all sorts of other stuff too. Could just be a military satellite. Could be another anti-satellite device, kind of like the Russians have been using, or tested at least, to take out military satellites, communication satellites. But it certainly is at least possible that it's some kind of EMP device. And so, since that would be such a disastrous event in terms of what it would do to the country, whatever country's attacked, it's worth doing at least some minor preparations for. I've often said that a true, widespread grid down event that people think about in terms of doomsday prepping is pretty unlikely, but one of the more likely ways that it could happen is some kind of EMP weapon, because that's really one of the few ways that the grid could go down over a vast area, and not only the grid, but vehicles and things like that. And speaking of vehicles, there's been a lot of talk also of the test in the 90s by the Nuclear Energy Commission, I believe it was, that did an EMF field test on vehicles. They found that something like a lot of vehicles, most of them at least, shut off. A lot of them came back online immediately or pretty quickly, something like at least 40 or 50%. I think somewhere in the 40 to 60% range had serious problems to where you couldn't rely on it working after an EMP. But let's just say it's 50-50. That was in the 90s, I think mid to late 90s, 94 to 96, somewhere in that range. Incidentally, my bug out vehicle, my white Phillip, my Bronco, he is a 94. And so he might fall into that 50-50. But vehicles nowadays, most modern vehicles, especially if it was in the last 2 or 3 years, everything is electronic on there. Even the key fob, the vehicles won't start. You don't even use a physical key. It's using a fob. It's probably some kind of passive RID reader or whatever. I don't know how it works. But all of that stuff has minor electronics in it. That even if the engine system, the fuel injection, all that's working fine, or at least working enough, there's so many other little things that can go wrong that will cause the vehicle not to operate properly. I know a friend had a vehicle, I think it was a Mustang, that the keys could be programmed to have different settings, to where you could give your son a key, and then you could put the settings on that key to be that the car couldn't go over a certain speed or whatever. So there's lots of electronically controlled stuff. Every one of those features, and his car started spazzing out to where it wouldn't recognize the real key and was putting him in these weird settings, like the child controls or whatever. And so all that stuff, every little aspect of that is controlled by some sensor, some microprocessor, some chip, that could easily be disrupted by some kind of EMP event. So I think that chance of vehicles working is a lot lower now with much more modern vehicles than it was in the 90s. But regardless, there's definitely a good reason to do at least some basic preparations. So what most people use is some kind of Faraday cage to protect electronics. Now, I have some small Faraday cages. I don't really have a huge electronic system for a power generation or anything yet, which I would like to get some sort of solar generator. I'm still trying to work on that. But so right now I only have small items in Faraday cages, flashlights, red dot scope for weapons, things like that, some radios. So here is my latest construction. This is one obviously that is built to not have to get into very often. If you have something that you really need to access frequently and you want to be able to have it in some kind of EMP protection Faraday cage, you need to either make something out of the fabric that the tape can be pulled on and off of frequently, or the little pouches are probably the best bet for individual. And so there's a few small things that I'm going to either make or get pouches out of. The EMP fabric on Amazon and stuff, I would be careful with. I've had people, or some of the replies on there say it doesn't even seem to block cell phone calls and radios and things like that. Now, it isn't true. I mean, it's true that just because something blocks a radio or a cell phone doesn't mean it would be effective EMP protection. Like a microwave, people put a lot of things in microwaves. Those are not effective EMP protection, even though a lot of times it will block signals for radios and cell phones. But it's usually true the other way, as far as I know, that if it's not at least blocking radio, cell phone, that is probably not going to work as an EMP protection from a nuclear EMP, which, as we know, is slightly different from a solar flare type thing, which wouldn't really harm small electronics not connected to the grid. But I wanted to put everything in this, first of all, because it's bigger than these buckets that we've seen, but also these are really hard to use for a lot of reasons. As some of you guys might not know, the main danger with breaches in an EMP is not holes, especially not like pinholes. Like if you make something out of, this is aluminum foil bolstered pretty significantly with the conductive tape, which I'll have the link to this stuff in the description. That's great for doing all sorts of EMP protection, but aluminum foil works as well for the most part. And it's cardboard box inside, so nothing is actually touching the aluminum foil from the inside. But like a small pinhole, maybe even a pencil-sized hole, is usually not even as big of a problem as a long seam, like you would see on these tins and buckets like this. And just because of how the waves propagate, the whole one pinpoint hole is just not as much, or a little tear is not as much of a problem as a long seam. Now these can be, of course, bolstered with the tape or other material, but because of the shape of this, you would have to do all the way around the bottom seam, this seam, any of the breached by the rivets along the lid. Even when the lid is on, you'd have to make sure that. So it's really difficult and messy, kind of. It's actually a lot easier and probably takes the same amount of tape or aluminum foil to just cover some other sort of container. Or if you were gonna get a metal container, something square like a filing cabinet, that the only seams were on the edges, you could cover a lot better with this. So these still work great if you do it right, but it's just a lot of extra work. So I'm moving away from that into the just the homemade one here. I know that one of the best resources for EMP stuff to begin with is the EMP Doctor channel. I think that's his channel name, but that's what he goes by. Here on YouTube, I'll put a link to that as well. He is he gives you all the real data, and he has an actual, he went so far as to build like an EMF field generator, which is very expensive for most people. So he can actually test a lot of the stuff that he's built, and he sells the fabric and stuff, so he knows that the fabric that he sells works. So I would get that if you are looking into that sort of stuff. But it's pretty simple, and then most of the stuff that you see people talking about and doing is close to right, but there's a few of those myths, like the microwaves working and things like that as being and he has the ability to actually test his stuff. So like I said, most of what I have in here is lights and a few small solar panels, chargers, stuff like that. So I think I have like a red dot sight, a bunch of flashlights, two-way radios. I don't have really the resources right now, at least, to set up to where major electronics or major power generation sources could be EMP protected. So this is basically just in the event that something crazy happens that we have an EMP. Most of the stuff I obviously have is not going to work, but I'll still be able to generate some small amount of power for lights and tiny appliances, but only the ones that are protected. So, but light is a big one, obviously. Most of my cooking and everything plan is not relying on electricity. I have a sun oven, I have propane grills, don't need electricity for those. So it's basically just small communications. I have the radio, I have flashlights, I have two-way radios for local communications, and at least one red dot sight in there that I could use if everything goes crazy. But you know, if you have a solar generator, which I'm still trying to get my hands on one of those, I'll make an individual box for it. And you would probably also have to have protection for the solar panels if they have any sort of small electronics in it. You know, solid state electronics like just wires and stuff like that are unlikely to be damaged, but anything that has chips in it, microprocessors, which these days, a lot of stuff, even some flashlights will have little controls in them of various kinds. They're not just a battery, a wire, and a bulb anymore. So pretty much anything that's electronic these days, you should at least do some protection if you're expecting it to work. But it's definitely worth thinking about, because relatively small preparations like that, like protecting some key electronics, are easy. You know, you just get some sort of Faraday protection and you should be pretty good to go. The actual ramifications of dealing with a widespread EMP are insanely serious. I mean, it would send the country back to the Stone Age. So there's a lot more that goes along with it, but the physical act of protecting smaller electronic devices is relatively simple. You just have to put them in a real EMP protection. And I recommend the EMP Doctor channel. He covers a lot of this stuff. I have links in the description to a few items that work for that or should work for that, but it's one of those things it's hard to know who to trust because you can't test those. It's very expensive to have an EMF field generator to test those things. So do I think that the US is going to be hit with an EMP device? You know, no, I don't think so. If I actually thought it was going to happen, I certainly would do a lot more significant preparations, but it's obviously possible. And like I mentioned in one of my old videos, the grid of preparedness, things to prepare for, the things that are unlikely but very, very serious still bear some level of preparation for, just because of how serious it would be. That even though it's unlikely, if I can improve my chances of dealing with that and saving myself, my family, whatever, with just some minor preparations, like, you know, for nuclear, getting the gas mask, for EMP, protecting some critical electronic devices, things like that, that is worth doing, because for a roll of aluminum foil and foil tape and cardboard box or whatever, you can protect some things that would make a massive difference if that were to happen. I think what's also very important to focus on is the fact that obviously it would be China or Russia, but if China specifically, if we have any issues with China going forward, and I absolutely think we will, I officially predicted that China will enter the conflict in some way, maybe not directly with Ukraine, but with Taiwan or some other form of economic warfare with the United States. And when that happens, everything we get from China, even if they decide not to EMP us, everything we get from China, which is everything, will be extremely difficult to get after that point, because they'll probably just cut off all exports completely to us. And one of the more important things that we get from them are massive amounts of antibiotics. It's not exclusively from China, but at least generic antibiotics come like 90% from China. So I definitely recommend the Jace case. Talked about that before, put link in the description. You don't have to get the fish antibiotics. From what I understand, there's nothing wrong with the fish antibiotics, but with Jace, you get an actual, prescription for them. So if you needed to travel with them or anything like that, you're not going to have as many issues. You can trust them a little more, that the controls that the stuff has gone through is at least slightly better than fish pills. And it's just a lot cleaner of a process. It comes with the information on how to use it, the dosages and all that. So unless you're just so, important that you pinch every penny, it's really not that much more to get it through Jace at all. And it's so much cleaner, so much more simpler, so much more, gives you much more peace of mind, in my opinion. You get the actual little case with the actual human medicine, with the prescription, with the dosage information. I'm so glad I had that. It's one of my favorite preps right now. It's right up there with like the sun oven and a few other things. It just gives you a massive, massive peace of mind. And you can have each family member, I think, can get up to one each year. But even one or two will go a long way to keeping you, because most people aren't having to use antibiotics constantly. But if there were any sort of massive disaster scenario, especially grid down, disease is going to be one of the things that crops up a lot. People are not used to living in these unsanitary conditions with, stress and lowered immune systems from not having enough nutrition and whatever. And maybe, sewage and sanitation services aren't working as well. So something that almost always happens in disaster scenarios is disease and different types of infections skyrocket. And there's just no alternative for antibiotics. You can't, there's always some kinds of natural remedies that work for certain things, but once it gets to the point that you have a massive infection that your body can't fight, really the only thing that's going to work is antibiotics, so you just can't improvise that. So definitely check them out. We also are seeing an amoxicillin shortage right now, so I know they at least have a little bit left because they emailed about it, so now is the time to get that stuff if you need to. But let me know what you guys think about the EMP specifically. Do you think this is some kind of EMP weapon that China put into the space, or just a run-of-the-mill military secret satellite. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll talk to you soon.